All right. This is the prayer. This is like the best sort of prayer about scriptures that I know of in our Book of Common Prayer. It happens to be the prayer um, for the Sunday nearest November 16th. So let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, which you've given us in our Savior Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. All right, so today we're going to look at the 10 Commandments, and I need to get this screen sharing thing out of, there we go. So they show up in the Bible. That's the first obvious place. And the first place they show up is the book of Exodus, which, if you can see this, then can you see my screen okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
How do I do it?
All right. So they show up in Exodus, but they also show up in Deuteronomy. And I think it's worth, since we're going to talk about these, reading through all of them. So if we just trade, I'll start and I'll do this, and Bob and or Norma, can you do this second section, and Cherry the third, and we'll just go from there. Does that work? Oh, and Charlotte's here too.
Father Matt, I'm trying to get my speaker. I've got a headset, so I'm trying to share. So I might be out of pocket to do anything until I can get my sound on my computer instead of on my headset.
Oh, okay. I'll do this. I'll read with Cherry. Can you and I switch back and forth? Does that work? Okay. So I'll start. God spake all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me.
You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and the fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments.
You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name.
Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it.
Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land the Lord your God is giving you.
You shall not murder.
You shall not commit adultery.
You shall not steal.
You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor.
You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor.
When all the people witness, oh, that's it. Okay, so that's the 10 Commandments from Exodus. We're going to read them again from Deuteronomy, and you'll see they're pretty similar but slightly different. So they're repeated in Deuteronomy, and I'll give a little bit of the background after we read the Deuteronomy version. Okay, Charlotte, does your audio work? You're muted, so see if you can unmute. All right.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Okay.
All right. So this is the second version of the 10 Commandments. And so we're just going to trade paragraphs again. Okay. Does that work?
Okay. Yes, that works.
Hear, O Israel, the statutes and ordinances that I'm addressing to you today. You shall learn them and observe them diligently. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. Not with our ancestors did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us here alive today. The Lord spoke with you face to face at the mountain out of the fire. At that time, I was standing between the Lord and you to declare to you the words of the Lord, for you were afraid because of the fire and did not go up to the mountain. And he said,
I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me.
You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the thousandth generation of those who love me and keep my commandments.
You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name.
Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male or female slave, or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock, or the resident alien in your lands, in your towns, so that your male and female slaves may rest as well as you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day.
Honor your father and your mother, as the Lord your God commanded you, so that your days may be long and that it may go well with you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you.
You shall not murder.
Neither shall you commit adultery.
Neither shall you steal.
Neither shall you bear false witness against your neighbor.
Neither shall you covet your neighbor's wife.
Neither shall you desire your neighbor's house or field or male or female slave or ox or donkey or anything that belongs to your neighbor.
Okay, great. Now, if you actually count on these, you see that there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And if you count the other ones in Exodus, you will see that there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And if you grew up a Roman Catholic, you probably have a more familiarity with this breaking, where coveting is divided into 2 commandments as opposed to just 1. And so a couple of questions. A, why not 11 commandments? Why 10? And the reason is the Bible actually, not in these 2 chapters or passages, but in a different place. And as an aside, this website is called Bible Gateway, and it's phenomenal. You can look at any number of translations you want and compare them, and in different languages. It's not English, it's all sorts of different languages. And you can do word searches. So I just did a word search for 10 commandments, and you note that it comes up 5 times in the Bible. In Exodus, where we just read, the header is 10 commandments. That's not actually in the text, so that doesn't count. In Deuteronomy, where we just read, the header is also the 10 commandments. Again, that's not in the text, so it doesn't count. But in these other 2 places, in Exodus 34 and in Deuteronomy 4 and in Deuteronomy 10, it's explicitly referred to as the 10 commandments. And they are set aside as something that is before the rest of the law. And the reason different denominations and frankly different religions count them differently really depends on if they're looking at Exodus first, if they're looking at Deuteronomy first, or which translation they're looking at. And the Roman Catholic version is clearly coming a little bit more out of the Deuteronomy setup, but it's also coming out of St. Augustine, who the Bible he was using, which was a Greek translation of the Old Testament, divided them generally more like the Deuteronomy setup. So there's been 2 different variants, and some Christians will, the Catholics are the obvious one, will combine these first 2, I am the Lord and idols, into one thing, and break up the last one, which is the coveting, and use the version from Deuteronomy, which is the wife on the one hand and then all the property on the other hand, right? Does that ring a bell to everybody? So if you look at our church on Sunday morning, during the videos that we have, behind me, you will see that gold wall, and the 10 Commandments are over my left shoulder. And at some point when you're in church again, come up and look at them, and you will see that they are the Exodus version, and they are broken into the more Protestant Jewish way of doing things, which is that coveting is one commandment, and I am the Lord, no other gods is its own commandment, and idols is a second commandment. So that's how the 10 are broken up. There's no real wrong way to do it, but 10 is the number. And if you noticed in Deuteronomy, some of them are much longer, right? Like the Sabbath one is a bit longer. The honor your father and your mother one is quite a bit longer. And the idol one is also a little bit longer. Oops, I just lost that. And that's in part because of the context, which is the reason I read this first little bit, was to put it into some context. In Exodus, we are really early on. They're in the wilderness. This is the first time Moses gets the 10 Commandments. He goes up onto the mountain and onto Mount Horeb. You probably know the story. It's for 40. The people don't want to go because they're afraid. So Moses goes up alone. He's up there for 40 days. God gives Moses the 10 Commandments. I believe it's in Exodus, where it actually says that God wrote them with his finger. And then there's a lot more laws after that. And 40 days later, Moses comes back down from the mountain. And if you remember what happens, the people, they think he's dead, right? So they're like, oh, he's been eaten by the fire and by God on the mountain. And so they create the golden calf while he's up there. And if you've ever seen the Mel Brooks History of the World movie, where Mel Brooks comes down as Moses, and he's got 3 tablets, and he drops one, and he's like, the 10 Commandments, and well, that's not what actually happens. What actually happens is he comes down, he gets mad because the people have this golden calf, and he smashes them, and he has to go up, and they get remade at some point soon after that. And Moses goes up again for 40 days and comes back down. But the end result is that they keep getting reminded of them. So when we run into the 10 Commandments again in Deuteronomy, this little introduction tells you we're quite a bit later, right? This is looking back at this has already happened. And so it's a slightly different version because it's a slightly later time. And normally when people think of the 10 Commandments, they jump to the Exodus version. And that's usually the ones that most of our confirmation classes learn about. As a minor aside, there nowhere does it say, it only says 2 tablets. It doesn't say that there's 4 on one and 6 on another. There's some great traditions in Judaism in particular. One of them is that each tablet has all 10 written on them, because in ancient covenants, you had to have 2 copies for each party, and the 10 Commandments are part of this whole covenant. So 1 copy is God's and 1 copy is the people's. Another really great tradition is that and in that version, it's 2 copies and it's front and back. In another version, there's a great tradition where God's finger writes through the stone, and each copy is, and again, it's 2 copies, but they can be read equally on front and back. And God writes all the way through the stone, and it's a miracle that you can read it frontwards and backwards, if that makes sense. Another one is that there's two tablets, and they're broken up as 4 on and 6 on one, which is what most of our versions seem to be. And again, if you look in our church, you will note that those gold, the gold things where it's written are tablet shaped, like that classic kind of tablet shape. And that's obviously intentional. So that's some basic background. The 10 Commandments are not just limited to the Old Testament to the Hebrew scriptures. They also show up. Jesus, as you probably remember, quotes most of them. This is from Mark. You know the commandments. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not defraud, honor your father and your mother. It's worth noting that the order that Jesus quotes is a different order than either Exodus or Deuteronomy. So maybe his confirmation class was slightly different. I don't know. But they have there's a variety of different orders. Same thing, St. Paul quotes those same commandments. You shall not commit adultery, murder, steal, covet, and any other commandment. So he summarizes them in a slightly different way. And love your neighbor as yourself comes from Paul, but also from Jesus, and obviously from Leviticus prior to that. So that's a quick summary of the biblical sort of 10 commandments. I've got quite a bit more to talk about, but they are generally one of the things that distinguishes them from the rest of the law is, did you notice there's no punishments? Most of the law has, if you do A, B happens to you, right? But in the 10 commandments, there's no punishments whatsoever. And they're generally viewed as guideposts, as kind of starting points. And a lot of Christian and Jewish theologians and rabbis and preachers and what have you have often tried to link other parts of the law to given commandments, and kind of started with a commandment and gone from there. Sometimes people link them together. An obvious one is coveting your neighbor's wife leads to adultery, right? Coveting your neighbor's property leads to stealing or possibly murder, right? And that sort of thing. Stealing sometimes ends up leading to bearing false witness, right? So you get into one and you often go to the other. Once you have no other gods, you often make an idol, and you fail to do these other things. So they tend to be linked together and kind of viewed from a starting point in terms of big picture ethics. And I think it speaks volumes that they've been passed down to us for a long time. Both Jewish and Christian worship have a deep tradition of reading the 10 Commandments regularly. Currently, I believe Jewish worship reads them 3 times a year as part of the readings from Torah. At one point, I believe they were read daily, but that led people to think that the 10 Commandments were all that mattered, and they weren't worrying about all the rest of the law. So they stopped reading them daily because they wanted to make sure that everybody was focusing on the whole law. In Christian worship, if you go back to the Reformation, to use one starting point, the 10 Commandments were often the things that replaced a lot of the art that the reformers threw away. And so one of the reasons you have churches, and ours is an example, but you have churches with the 10 Commandments all over the place, it was sort of the approved scriptural artwork that could be put up everywhere. And so they were put up everywhere, but they also show up in our liturgies. And that's the next part of this little class. But before we move on, anybody have any comments or questions about the sort of biblical background? We're going to look, just to be clear, we're going to look at where they are in the Book of Common Prayer and how we use them. And then the end of this sort of 45-minute session, we're going to talk about how you move from a guidepost into sort of ethical stuff on each one of these. So if you've got ethical questions, save that for a little bit. But if you have basic Bible questions, now is a great time.
I have a question about the Deuteronomy version. Is part of the story with the Deuteronomy version really that Moses goes to the mountain and is given a second set?
No, this is, well, he gets a second set in Exodus. Like he goes down and then comes back up. And this, so
Okay.
if you go backwards in Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy is like Deuteronomy is the 5th book of the Pentateuch, and it kind of summarizes. It's often viewed to be a later book, and it sort of summarizes a lot of the law in a slightly different way. So I'm just going backwards, and um, it starts with events at Horeb recalled, and it kind of moves along from there. So it's more of a retelling than it is like it doesn't happen another time. It's kind of retelling things, and Deuteronomy kind of reframes and retells everything that had come before. It doesn't go through everything, but it retells a good chunk of it. Um, and it's, yeah, I hope that makes sense. Does that?
Yeah, no, that does. Thank you.
Anything else? All right,
Nora.
All right, let's jump to the, oh, this is I hesitate to recommend Wikipedia for any reason ever, because Wikipedia is totally hit and miss. But for general Bible stuff, Wikipedia usually is a bit of a mess, but has really good information. So if you want to kind of delve in to a wide variety of background on things, the Wikipedia 10 Commandments thing is interesting. And it has this chart which gives you where the different commandments are and what order they are in different places. So there's that's worth looking at on your own time, and it goes into different religious traditions and Judaism, Catholicism, Latter-day Saints, Islam, and so they get into all these different, and it probably goes into. It wouldn't surprise me if it jumps into some of the background with Hittite treaties, yeah, and of course, United States display over public property, right? We have to have that with the 10 Commandments too. We're not going to deal with that today, but if you jump into, there's two sites that are worth knowing about. One is where we started with the prayer, which is it's BCP Online, and this site is very useful for kind of bouncing around the Book of Common Prayer. And the 10 Commandments show up in two places in our Eucharist. And I hope you can sort of see it. I'm going to expand a tiny bit. I can't expand. So in Rite 2, which is what most of us are used to, I think, they show up in the penitential order, and the Decalogue is the Greek word for 10 Commandments. But you may remember this from Lent, and if you don't, Lent is near enough that you're going to get to see it again. But when we do most of Lent, we start with bless the Lord who forgives all our sins. And then we either jump into the Great Litany or we jump into the 10 Commandments, and the Decalogue may be said. And at our church, we do. So we go through this, and it's a short form of it. It's nowhere near as long as what's in Exodus, but it follows the Exodus pattern. One God, idols, the name of the Lord, Sabbath day, honor your father and mother, murder, adultery, steal, witness, and covet. And each one is set in a sort of liturgical formulary where the priest reads the commandment and everybody else responds, Amen, Lord, have mercy. And it's a nice way, I think, of beginning every service in Lent. The Rite 2 version is similar, but a little longer, which is the way Rite 2 often works. So the Rite 2 version is a little closer to what's actually in Exodus. And again, it's the same liturgical setup, but instead of Amen, Lord, have mercy, I actually prefer the Rite 1 version. Lord, have mercy upon us and incline our hearts to keep this law. And so we do that at Rite 1, we do the other one at Rite 2, and we do that throughout Lent. But I find it very useful to remind people each year what the 10 Commandments actually are. Every year I run through them with our confirmation class, and we memorize them, and everybody kind of messes the order up, which is okay. But the order does matter. It's in, we tend to do, if anybody says, what's the fifth commandment? If you're a Protestant or an Anglican, you say it's honor your father and your mother. If you're Roman Catholic, you say do not murder, I think, but the order basically does matter. But there's this other thing in our prayer book called the Catechism. It's called an Outline of Faith. I refer to it from time to time, and here's a bigger print version. But the Catechism answers all sorts of questions. And in our prayer book on page 847 we are on, it talks about the 10 Commandments. And if you see what our Catechism says about the 10 Commandments, and I do this with our confirmation class each year, the 10 Commandments are the laws given to Moses and the people of Israel. What do we learn from these commandments? We learn two things: our duty to God and our duty to our neighbors. And this is what we spend most of our time with the confirmation class dealing with. And this is where we're going to make the jump into kind of more ethical type of stuff. Our Catechism divides them into two parts: our duty to God and our duty to our neighbors, which summarizes that great commandment from Jesus: love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your strength. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like unto it: love your neighbor as yourself. So it divides it into these two parts, and then takes each commandment and summarizes them or kind of expands on them. And I'll play the same game I play with my confirmation class with you guys. Does anybody know which, without looking, which commandments to love and obey God and to bring others to know him might be?
The part about bringing others to know him, I don't think is there.
No, it's not. No. So it's all of these are really big expansions, right? It's not listed as what are the 10 Commandments. It's listed as more, think of it in terms of an ethical thing. So which commandment might be a starting point that gets you to love and obey God and to bring others to know him?
I'd have to cheat and look.
Well, how about this one? This one's a little easier. To put nothing in the place of God.
Yeah, no idols.
No idols,
Yeah,
right?
worship idols.
Okay, how about this one? To show God respect in thought, word, and deed.
Where you use his name.
Right? This one's easy too. And so to set aside regular times for worship, prayer, and the study of God's ways.
Keep the Sabbath
Keep
holy.
the Sabbath day holy.
So this one is that first one. They're actually in order. It's there is only one God, right? I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. And it's interesting because this is not the same thing. This is a much kind of broader view of this. And so this is kind of like, okay, so what might it mean for Christians to look at the first commandment and to try to live it out? And it's like, okay, it's to love and obey God. And if there's only one God, and you're supposed to love that God, then, and I'll use like the example of, if you love, you go to a museum, right? And you've seen this painting and you're like, this is unbelievable. I love this thing. And you start dragging people to see it, right? Or if you really like a piece of music, you share it with people, right? Because you love it. Or if you are really, you know what I mean? Anything that you really, really like and kind of get into, people share with others. And the logic here is that, well, if you really love God, then it's your Christian, and this is the duty part of it, it's your Christian duty not only to love and obey God, but also to basically be evangelists, right? To be people that go out and say, you got to check this out. This is fantastic. And so bring people in. I don't know if it's true. There's this great meme that has Abraham Lincoln that says, not everything you see on the internet is true, and it's attributed to Abraham Lincoln, who of course didn't know about the internet. But I saw on the internet somebody put up on one of these memes that evangelical Christians tell people about their church and bring them to worship something like 17 times a year, and Episcopalians do it once every 27 years.
Oh, wow.
Oh, like, so whether or not those numbers are true, I can tell you that we Episcopalians have some work to do in terms of this bringing others to know God. Um, so that's these other ones are, uh, this I think the to put nothing in the place of God is um, a little easier to wrap your head around in terms of, okay, maybe it's just me, but when I think of idols, in particular because of the Exodus story, I think of like a golden statue, right? Like the golden calf or something like that. Or I think of the book of Daniel, where the giant idol is in the pagan temple, and it keeps falling over and that sort of thing. Um, and this is a reminder, I think, that our world doesn't tend to have those same physical statue idols. It tends to have sort of things in people's lives that they put in place of God, right? And you can think of almost anything that can fill that can fit into that category: money, power, uh, political issues, pleasure, whatever, right? Like any number of things can be. I mean, I think all of us probably know people who their entire life is all about um, whatever it is, thrill seeking or money or something like that. And if you begin to kind of think about that with this, are people doing things that are putting, whatever it is into the place of God? And sometimes the answer is yes. So from a Christian perspective, I think we're called to regularly evaluate our lives and make sure that nothing is being put in the place of God. I think that makes sense. This third one, I always have fun with the kids on this one because I think the next Bible study we'll talk about the name of the Lord is the next one. And, that all caps Lord, we'll dig into some of the background on that. You may know that there's a Jewish tradition throughout most of Judaism to this day where observant Jews will not say the name of the Lord. So they substitute the Hebrew word Lord for the Hebrew word that loosely was translated I am who I am, which we get from Exodus. And so they'll always say Lord, which comes down to us. The Christian perspective on that is that often people kind of overlook is, how do you use the name of Jesus Christ, right? It's not unusual to hear people, and Christians as well, using Jesus Christ as if it were a modified swear, right? Like, I have a hammer, I hit my thumb with the hammer. What do I say? I swear, and oh, Jesus Christ, or something like that, right? That would be somewhat disrespectful, to say the least, right? So I always tell our confirmation class every year, next time you do that, consider whether or not you were breaking the third commandment, to use the Lord's name in vain, and that kind of thing. We don't have a tradition where we're not allowed to say the name Jesus, but how you use that name is important. And you can actually jump a little further. If we're all children of God, how do you respect not just God, but each other, right? And how do you speak about in thought, word, and deed other children of God? So you can kind of jump out from there as well. And this one, the fourth one, is the Sabbath and keep it holy. You probably know that the Jewish Sabbath is Saturday. And Christians, if you Wikipedia Sabbath, you'll get all sorts of stuff on that too. But Christians mostly observe their Sabbath on Sunday, but it's not always viable. And sometimes people have to work, sometimes people are doing other things and that sort of thing. And the Episcopal Church has always said, set aside regular times for worship, prayer, and the study of God's ways. I would argue that the Sunday is still mandatory, for lack of a better way of putting that, and that this is an expansion into more often times. Things like exactly what you're doing, right? You are up at 8 a.m. on a Thursday for the study of God's ways. So I commend you, right? And we began with prayer. And so seeking out and setting out those regular times, I think, are pretty important. Any comments on this section? All right, the second part is our duty to our neighbors, and it does the same thing. It sort of summarizes our duty to our neighbors is to love them as ourselves and to do to other people as we wish them to do to us. That's the golden rule. And then it's listed out in the next 6 commandments, which again expands on them, right? So the 5th commandment is honor your father and your mother. This one is to love, honor, help our parents. And then it moves beyond that in 3 ways. First, it moves beyond honor and adds in love and help. And then it moves into family in general, and then goes one step beyond that, which is to honor those in authority, but puts a little bit of conditions on it, which is, and to meet their just demands, which is kind of helpful. So it takes parent figures, biological parent figures, and expands it in a number of ways to all of your family, and in fact, all in authority, and begins to help you deal with, I think, how does one honor and respect and help people in authority as well. So I think this is an interesting one. The next one is one of the big ones, right? If you had to guess which one this is, to show respect for the life God has given us, to work and pray for peace, to bear no malice, prejudice, or hatred in our hearts, and to be kind to all the creatures of God. Which commandment is that one?
Bear no false witness against thy neighbors.
Nope, not quite. That's a little later. Here's the key word.
Murder?
Murder. This one is the murder one, right? This is quite an expansion, right?
Yeah.
So the murder one, it's worth getting into. The murder one is, sometimes you'll see it as thou shalt not kill, thou shalt do no murder. And this takes the tack that is the far more expansive tack. There's a lot of study on this particular commandment, and a lot of writing and ethical opinions on how should one take it. Gets into capital punishment, gets into war, is taking any life in any circumstance breaking this commandment, or are there exceptions? And historically, it was viewed as murder, which means there are, ethical exceptions where I wouldn't go so far as to say it's okay, but it's justified, if that makes sense. Historically, also, there's plenty of people that will read it more as thou shalt not kill, and grant very, very few justified exceptions. This tends to take that tack, but expands it far more into daily life. You've probably heard sermons from time to time on, well, let's look at this commandment. One way to think about this is, can you murder somebody with your words, right? Assassinate their career or their character or something like that. And this sort of falls into that category of, having so much hatred in your heart that even though you're not going to kill somebody, you're going to do everything you can to take them apart and take them down. It also expands it, interestingly, to all creatures, which gets into ethics of how you treat animals and creation care and that sort of thing. And it's just really big. And I would argue that this is a really wonderful starting point for an entire Bible study, right? Like, you can go down this road for quite some time and have some really good conversations. But this is a starting point, and being aware of time, we only have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to cruise through. This is another expansion. Any guess which one? To use all our bodily desires as God intended is kind of which
Adultery.
one? Adultery. Right. As you can guess, this one's always slightly difficult to talk about with the kids. So we just kind of, we don't move along, but we don't talk as long on it because they're in 8th grade. But it's the obvious expansion, right? Adultery is a part of a relationship being fractured. it just expands it to any use of your body, and goes from there. How about this one? Which one is this? To be honest and fair in our dealings, to seek justice, freedom, and the necessities of life for all people, and to use our talents and possessions as ones who must answer for them to God.
Covet thy neighbor's property?
Not quite. That's actually down here.
Okay.
There's only 3 left. There's covet, steal, and false witness. And interestingly, the way they've summarized it, this could be all 3 of those. But this one is false witness, right?
So it must be steal.
So this is steal, right? And it talks mostly about, okay, if you're going to expand on this, most people think, I think, when they think of thou shalt not steal as like armed robbery or going into a store and shoplifting or something like that. But those are obvious overt types of stealing. You can steal intellectual property. You can steal ideas. You can cheat on tests. You can steal people's wages, right? So some of these things like that, you can defraud somebody in a deal. There's all sorts of ways that you can steal and kind of wrap your head around, I'm just being a good business person, right? Or, well, I'm just doing what I need to do to get by in this, in this dog eat dog world kind of thing, right? And so this, I think, is actually one of the more useful ones because it in terms of expansions, because it really, I think, makes people look a little closer at the way they do their careers and the way they work with others. And for the kids in the confirmation class, how they deal with their academics and that kind of thing, right? Plagiarizing is clearly stealing, but it's not often thought about it in the same way. This one takes that and like totally turns it around and says, so if you're going to do this in your own life, now you need to seek that for everybody and kind of go out into the world and advocate for a fair and just society for all people, which is really an expansion off of thou shalt not steal. And then this last part of it is to use our talents and possessions as ones who must answer for them to God. I really like this because of this last thing, that at the end of the day, we're all going to have to answer to God about how we've led our lives and deal with things. And interestingly, much of what most of us do, if you consider the amount of hours that people put into to school or work or what have you, this is definitely up there in terms of how much people deal with others and things like that. And so how does your work week or your academic week, how Christian is it or not Christian is it? And if you had to if you had to tell God about all your business dealings, how would that work out, right? That's an interesting question. This is the false witness one. Obviously, the original commandment is in a trial, right? Is to not literally bear a false witness in a trial. And the expansion here is pretty obvious to jump to truth in general and misleading. Those 2 words over the last 20 years, truth and misleading, have come up more and more often than I think anybody thought they would. Another part of this is mislead others by our silence, which is interesting. So it's not just to speak the truth, but also to not be silent so that others are, so it's a nice expansion, I think. And the last one is covet, which is either wife or neighbor or property or whatever. And it expands it to resist temptations, to envy, greed, and jealousy, to rejoice in other people's gifts and graces, and to do our duty for the love of God who has called us into fellowship with him. I think the expansion here is pretty obvious. Envy, greed, and jealousy are probably words that we would normally use as euphemisms for covet today, or synonyms. What I like about this part is that Why should you not covet? Well, because God has given each of us different gifts. So I wouldn't say just be happy with the gifts, rejoice in the gifts that you have, but also rejoice in the fact that God has given other people other gifts, and try to work together in fellowship to have a more just society and that sort of thing. So that's those summaries. And the Catechism continues with two other things. What are the purpose of the Ten Commandments? The Ten Commandments were given to define our relationship with God and our neighbors. And the obvious one, since we do not fully obey them, are they useful at all? Since we do not fully obey them, we see more clearly our sin and our need for redemption. So we continue to revisit the Ten Commandments again and again and again. And I really love this little bit of the Catechism on page 847 and 848, because I think it can be, you can get bogged down in a question about murder. But if you start to go and deal with this, it can expand it into a much bigger conversation about what that might mean in different ways. So that's it. That's my Bible study. I went 2 minutes too long, but if you all have any questions and can stay, I'm happy to chat and take you off of the screen share if that works.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I hope that was useful.
It was.
When was that catechism written? That's contemporary?
Yeah, so that's from the 1979 Book of Common Prayer. The lead up to that Book of Common Prayer, it was about 20 years in terms of written text. It's actually much longer than that. A little bit of background, our Book of Common Prayer obviously comes originally from sort of the English Book of Common Prayer, right? And the first one was the 1549, and then there's the 1552 and 1559. And most people will say, right, and so the last Book of Common Prayer in England was 1662. But actually, our Book of Common Prayer comes more out of the Scottish tradition, which takes those first couple of ones, and that's another story for another day. But ours comes more out of the Scottish Book of Common Prayer. And our first one, I think, was 1786 is the first one. And then it gets revised pretty quickly. And then there's an 1891 that's another light revision. And then in 1928, which is the one that a lot of people grew up with, they came out with another prayer book. And during the discussions for that, they were like, we need to revise this, but we need to revise this a lot more than just what we did for the 28. So they began the groundwork for a much bigger prayer book revision. And in that revision is that catechism that gets, the Book of Common Prayer 1928 is much more of a open the book and pray. You don't have to really think about it. The readings are there for you. There's not really any options. What you pray is what you believe was kind of the mindset. And the 79 book gave you a bunch more different options, took a lot of the readings out, so you had to get other books. It's more of a resource book. And one of those resources is that catechism. And I think it's about 20 pages long. It's all question and answer, and it's really quite useful for kind of beginning to talk about any conversation on anything like that. So it's in comparison, the Catholic Catechism, I don't know if you can see, there's the companion and the regular Catholic Catechism, 2,000-page books. They go into much more depth. Our tradition is more of a question and answer and talk about it together. The Catholic tradition is more of, here's your question, here's our answer. Right? And nothing wrong with either one of those, but when you have to answer many more questions definitively, it takes 2,000 pages. So, there's also on my shelf, there's a really helpful book called the Westminster Book of Ethics, or Dictionary of Ethics. And there's books out there that kind of summarize a lot of the thinking on any ethical issue, which is really helpful, and gives you Jewish traditions or Islamic traditions or Christian traditions or Protestant or Catholic or what have you. So longer answer than you wanted, but there you go. So
No, that's actually exactly what I wanted. Thank you.
any other questions?
No, thank you. Very good.
That was
Thank-
excellent.
All right. So if you're up for it, our next one is next Thursday, again at 8 a.m. And one of these weeks, I don't think it's this week, but one of these weeks, I'm actually going to have to stop hard at 8:44 because I have another meeting at 8:45. But the next one is on the name of the Lord, and we'll dig into what that is in Hebrew scriptures, Christian scriptures, Old Testament, New Testament, and kind of go from there. And it will be obviously a little bit of an expansion off of that third commandment, do not take the name of the Lord in vain, and we'll kind of go from there. All right?
Thank you.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
Have a
Okay.
great day. Okay.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.